Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. I must say I'm a bit puzzled by today's hearing topic. It seems intended to demonize people who use their own money to buy and even build as little as 1% of the single-family houses in America. At least one of today's witnesses represents a group that rejects the concept of private property altogether, stating on their website as they do, and I quote, "We envision a United States where land and housing are publicly owned," end quote. Let me just say for the record, I think private home ownership is vastly preferable to state ownership of homes. In fact, it's a big part of the American dream. Now, there's nothing wrong with people renting homes instead of or before becoming homeowners, and there's nothing wrong with investors putting their own money to work to meet the needs of renters. Now, if Democrats are concerned about investors crowding out home buyers, then I hope they'd agree that taxpayers certainly shouldn't subsidize loans to investors. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has a different view. The administration lifted existing restrictions on the ability of Fannie and Freddie to buy loans from single-family home investors. That's a taxpayer giveaway. That's why I'm introducing legislation to prohibit the GSEs from acquiring investor property mortgages, and I hope my colleagues will co-sponsor it. Today, what I think we should be focusing on is the $3.5 trillion elephant in the room, the Democrats' reckless tax and spend spree, which includes $300+ billion for housing. Now, billions of this aid is not targeted. Some of these programs have weak means testing and loopholes. Forget about work requirements, even for able-bodied adults with no dependents. They and many people of above-average income will do quite well under some of these programs. Let's consider a few of the bill's particularly misguided housing provisions. Start with the $9 billion in down payment assistance for first-time and first-generation homebuyers. Well, this is rife with problems. First of all, you can qualify even if you or your parents previously owned a home. So much for first-time and first-generation. Second, you don't have to have a low income. A member of Congress could qualify for a taxpayer-funded down payment in Washington, D.C. under this program. Third, there's an invitation to mortgage fraud. A home buyer only has to attest to being a first-generation home buyer. There's no other diligence required. And in fact, lenders are explicitly exempt from liability even if they knowingly accept a false attestation. And worst of all, the program is a thinly disguised attempt to give assistance to homeowners based more on the color of their skin than their financial need, something that's very likely unconstitutional. Democrat Chairwoman Maxine Waters has said the objective of the program is to help address the racial wealth and home ownership gaps. The director of the liberal National Fair Housing Alliance has said you cannot address issues of racial inequity if you do not address housing inequity. It is an impossibility. They're so inextricably linked. And thus, the bill text directs the HUD secretary to allocate funds in part based on, quote, racial disparities in home ownership rates, end quote. Now, increasing wealth and home ownership rates among minorities is a perfectly fine goal, but designing race-based policies and benefits is not. The Democrats' reckless tax and spend bill also has $80 billion for renovating public housing. Now, this is a bit odd, because the Biden administration requested only $40 billion. So why does the bill have $80 billion? Well, it just so happens that the New York City Housing Authority wanted $40 billion all for itself. But our Democratic colleagues knew they couldn't very well pass a bill that sent 100% of that money to New York City. Might be a bit of a problem for the 48 Democrat senators who don't represent New York City. So instead, Majority Leader Schumer publicly promised to, quote, double down on the administration's proposal and, quote, use all of my power as Majority Leader to secure a funding package that can restore and transform the New York City Housing Authority, end quote. And lo and behold, we now have $80 billion. Not to be distributed using the existing formula, mind you, rather by executive fiat. Certainly looks a lot like Senator Schumer securing a $40 billion earmark, or should we call it the Schumark. So it looks like half of all the bill's public housing dollars will go to a housing authority plagued by scandals, bribery, and chronic mismanagement. It's also distressing to see Democrats pouring billions into outdated public housing projects that concentrate poverty and crime and trap families in generational cycles of dependency and despair. 20 years ago, both parties recognized the flaws in government-controlled housing. That's why Congress capped the number of public housing units with the Faircloth Amendment. Now, the Democrats' reconciliation bill would waive this sensible law so new public housing units can go up. This is a remarkable return to government-owned housing and one that we will once again come to regret. So we need to try something different than big government socialism to help make housing affordable. We need to leverage the power of free enterprise, including private equity, to promote housing for all Americans. To that end, in March, I proposed a set of principles to guide housing finance reform discussions. Since then, the administration has shown no interest in reform and even missed the September 30 deadline to report on its own reform plan. In light of the issues that I've raised today, I hope this committee will hold hearings soon on long overdue topics like housing finance reform and mark up any reconciliation legislation so we have an opportunity to debate and offer amendments on housing policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.